Hello everyone. This is the second video for Unit 1. You have a lot of work to do this week, not the least of which is getting familiar with the readings and assignments. I'm not going to repeat it all because it's all listed in the unit instructions, but I will say after you watch the two videos in the introduction to the course and then these first two Unit 1 videos, do the readings, draft your first briefing memos. We're starting with a subject that you are more knowledgeable about than any of us at the table, so to speak. So your first task in writing is to brief me on specific questions that serve several purposes. 1, set the expectations for you and me. 2, give you practice with the memo writing format described in the syllabus and the videos. And 3, allow us to share our expectations amongst our peers, because we have to share information freely amongst all of us if we're going to all benefit. This last point is important because portions of the coursework will simulate committees, and committees require work that's seldom taught formally, but it has to be learned. Plain and simple, committees are the currency driving nonprofit sector activities. No pun intended. So more about this later in the course. The documents that you will encounter in the nonprofit reporting that we're going to use are found in annual reports that you can find online when you Google a nonprofit. Not all have them, but many do. And 990 tax report filings that you can gather from the GuideStar website. There's a search engine, you have to log in, you have to have your own account, but the documents that they have that support their tax filings are the ones that you would become familiar with it. I've got to tell you, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, because if you're not familiar with the forms, it's bewildering. So this exercise is to get familiar with the forms, because we're going to be using them. Along these lines, as I've mentioned, complexity is not your friend. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next few slides. So the goal is to keep things simple. And as I ask you to make the judgment calls to not to confuse it, keeping things simple with being too brief, which is an error many people make on their briefing memos. There's a difference between being brief and being clear. We'll get to that though. So the concepts we are considering in this course are cast within two major divisions of nonprofit organization: budget, operations, and planning, revenue, and expenses. Our work will rely on existing organizations. You can scan this image on your phone and you'll see a 990 form that will pop up as an example. And you can scroll through that, and that may make things a little bit easier as we get started. But on this form, this 990 form, it's like 75 pages. So being able to say that we're going to look at revenues and expenses should make things a little more palatable for you. In keeping with the spirit of keeping things simple, your approach to nonprofit finance in nonprofit settings is: don't spend more than you have. Well, how do you do that? Well, it requires planning and projecting, then regularly checking for differences or a variance between what you planned and what actually occurred. Keeping abreast of the performance allows you as a leader or manager to modulate your organization's finances. And this idea of modulation is tied to organizational resilience and adaptability. And we'll talk about that too later in the semester. Just to illustrate the challenges of keeping track, making sense, explaining to others, and just the simple creeping complexity that takes place in a nonprofit financial management situation. If you go to the supplement materials on Blackboard, there's a spreadsheet there. It's got 2 tabs. You don't have to do it this second, but you should do it after this video. On the spreadsheet, you will notice that there's a 2018 actuals tab, which is my organization, which I created from startup, or at least reinvigorated from startup as a startup. And I only had one. I had no advanced data, so it's 1 year. It's simply a log of expenditures. Since the log can get out of hand quickly, each line item is coded. The coding allows for sorting and comparing categories of expenses without having to do much beyond applying the formulas and functions on Excel. So I intentionally kept it simple. It's not dissimilar from the way that you might keep your own personal finances in order. You know, if you have a checkbook and you keep a log of expenses and you get paid once a month and you deduct your expenses from that total. That's what I did. So some people may go beyond that, and you can add notes and greater detail. But you'll notice a certain degree of detail is needed, and the challenge to find just the right amount, that Goldilocks amount, is greater as you have more complexity. So even more difficult is that planning assumptions you start with in the course of a year are seldom, an error-free. So you're wise to expect to make adjustments as you get more experience over time. So that second tab is a budget, the startup budget. And if you look through it, I can tell you from experience that just about all the assumptions I made were wrong. So going back to what I just said about keeping track, knowing the variance between what I planned and what actually happened is an important tool. So both of those documents are necessary, and the simplest way I'd be able to tell the story is by sharing both with you and keeping track of the actual history so that it can then be compared to annual assumptions. I hope you're able to follow that, because the point is the complexity arises with the detail. So my advice to you in interpreting this kind of work and in doing it is to put some thought into how you're going to keep this log and how you might use it. Your accountant may be doing that, but you'll still need to be familiar with it. This next point may be stating the obvious, but then again, maybe not. So you'll notice that because only 1 year of activity is actual, there's no history to compare the history after the first year. So over time, as you put more years in and form more columns and add more information, you'll know more, and your ability to predict will improve. It'll become sharper, and you'll have greater precision, and we would hope performance.